Okay, welcome to first episode of Keep It Simple podcast. My first guest with me today is Andrew Saleh. Andrew is a compliance officer, same as me. Have been for some time in compliance industry. But besides that, Andrew is also a charity worker, very much devoted to this topic as well. Very much devoted also to work in church, I would say. And church represents a big part of your life. So what I was interested in is how does this all of this make a combo? Like what is compliance for you, what is ethics for you, and how is it correlated with your religion and with everything that you do in your private life? Because I want to actually explore with you what is ethics for you.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for having me, first of all. I'm really glad I can be part of the episode and the first episode, actually. So that's an honor.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And yeah, I hope you were planning on doing a 2-hour episode because that's what it's going to take to answer this first question.
Yeah, I assume.
Um, how is it all connected? So yeah, as you already mentioned, even though if you know me and you know what I look like, you wouldn't expect it, right? But I am Christian and I go to church regularly, and I'm not only, let's say, a regular visitor, but I also serve in my church in
Mm.
different teams. Um, and as you have also already mentioned, I do some charity work as well sometimes. I used to do more in the past, especially when it came to, for example, human trafficking, sex trafficking. We have a couple of great organizations here in Vienna
Mhm.
that I used to be a part of, and I guess I kind of am still. And I would say it's all connected with compliance and what I do for a living now, because yeah, what's compliance? I guess the boring definition would be that to ensure that all external and internal laws, rules, regulations, etc., are being followed. Um, Raise the awareness accordingly, train your colleagues and employees accordingly, keep regular controls of all that. And I would say one of the reasons why it is connected, without going too much into details there or going too far, is that as a Christian, obviously, one of the first things that you will or everyone will probably think of are all the different rules that we have in not only Christianity, but also every religion, I guess, right? There are things that we are allowed to do, things that we are not allowed to do,
Yeah, it's a
things that we are
rule-based society.
supposed to do and not supposed to
Yeah.
do, right? And in Christianity, it's actually a little more complicated than that, because we believe that many of those rules actually don't really apply anymore ever since Jesus died on the cross and our sins were forgiven, and that's what we were also celebrating just recently and on Easter. But obviously, most of them are still applicable even nowadays, even though some people might think, those rules were given to us by God back then, thousands of years ago. It was a different time, a different era. The society was different, everything was different, and uh, yeah, it's not applicable anymore. It's unrealistic for people nowadays to wait, for example, and not to have sex before you get married and all that stuff, right? So those
Mhm.
are usually the first things that people bring up when discussing religion, at least in my personal experience. But what we need to understand is that most of those rules were given to us um, for our own good.
And,
And
and and that's actually the point of my initial question.
mm,
Like as I've said, you're a compliance officer, you do compliance, you do ethics topics, and what my sub question is actually,
mm,
does the religion part of you makes you a better compliance officer, and does it impact your ethical reasoning? And essentially, if one of the formulas for being more ethical is it to be more religious?
Um, tough one. So first of all, I guess yes. I would say that I am a quote unquote better compliance officer because of my faith, and I'm using the word faith here on purpose instead of religion, or because I think that also makes a big difference. But this is not a theology podcast, so let's
It's fine.
let's keep it simple. But because of my faith and because of what I believe, yes, I would say that definitely impacts the way I live, the way I think, the way I treat other people, for example, and stuff like that, right? But that doesn't mean that a person that doesn't share my belief, that might be, for example, a Muslim or a Buddhist or an atheist, doesn't matter, can't be as good or even better,
Mm.
or treat other people even better than I do, or whatever. Because obviously, it doesn't have to be connected to your faith. But in my case, I would say it it does. Obviously, I cannot say if I would be any different if I didn't believe what I believe, because I was
Yeah.
raised this way. I was born and raised Christian. Um,
Of
but
course,
yeah.
yeah, but the issue is because religion is in the core of your values,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So what I'm asking myself is whether our core values reflect on our organization performances, okay? Because
Mhm,
we are who we are.
mhm,
Some of us are religious, some of us are completely atheists, some of us are agnostics, whatever the case is.
mhm,
When it comes to that, it's completely diverse and everything's fine, everything goes. But it is true that the values you have, you carry them to your work.
mm,
So my issue here is uh, if you do not have certain set of values which are like common sense values,
mhm,
could you be ethical? In your case, that doesn't happen because of the religious factor. But
mm,
what do you think about people who are not religious, who are, for example, perceive themselves as atheists,
mhm.
identify as atheists, and they do not have the same set of values? Do you think that we can build values and standards in ourselves so we can bring them to our work and also say, okay, guys, I'm gonna do things correctly because I have it as my core values?
Uh, I think that's what most people do, and that's what society has been doing for the last, I don't know, centuries. Because in my opinion, and of course people might fight me on this, but I would say most of our values that we share as a society in general are actually built upon former, let's say, Christian values, and I know it might sound weird, but the way we treat each other, most of the laws that we have, and just to give you a stupid example, but you shall not kill, you know, um, yeah,
Yeah, it has a Judeo-Christian tradition in
exactly.
its
And
roots to some extent.
so that's
Yeah.
why I would say, yeah, definitely. Most people do share the same, or at least, let's say, here in the Western modern society, do share the same values and stuff like that. But regardless of whether they are Christian or not, or religious in general or not, or if they believe anything or not, So I think that's what we all
Yeah.
usually have in common. And that's why I also mentioned before that I don't think that this is actually that important when it comes to your behavior, your thoughts, your integrity, for example. That
Mhm. What is
I
integrity
don't
for
think we
you?
have mentioned so far, which in my opinion is very important as a compliance officer
Yeah.
as well, right?
Yes, yes.
So.
Many times people have asked
Mm,
me like, what do I think? What is
mhm,
a good
mhm,
compliance officer? What is like a no-go uh, qualities without which you cannot be
mm,
a compliance officer? And in my mind, integrity is one of the most important. But I want to
definitely.
know, what is integrity for you?
Hmm. uh, coming up with definitions off the top of my head. Always a struggle. But to keep it simple and practical, I would say integrity means that you follow the rules even when no one is looking. Right?
Okay,
So
I'll take that.
yeah, you
I have the opposite version of
all
that
right,
rule
yeah.
because it's follow the rules when everybody is looking.
But it's easy to do that when everyone is looking. You know what I mean?
Well,
But it's a lot more
sometimes.
tempting to break the rule when you know exactly that no one is watching. If you know exactly no one is watching, you know, I don't know how, but let's say you know that there will be no consequences. There's no way you could get caught, and you still decide to not break the rule, whatever the rule is, you know?
Yeah, but also it's very to follow the rules when everybody is looking. I mean that in sense when the pressure is higher. Okay? So
Good point.
when the pressure is the highest and when you know that your decision in this particular moment can either uplift you or downgrade you when it comes to your professional career, when it comes to your status in society or whatever,
Yeah.
and you do the right choice then and you show to people that you do stand behind your values is also a difficult task. So I would say that it goes both directions to be a person with integrity. So yeah, just to have a like a roadmap between the stuff that we have mentioned, you privately as a person being religiously active, being active in society as a member of society, as a contributor, as a charity worker. But on the other hand, also to delivering at your work. And as you said, a lot of people are very much confused what actually compliance is.
Yeah.
Many times people just think that we are there as compliance officer to bring out tons and tons of policies, to bring out blockers to the business,
Yeah.
to you know bring out the problems and say what's wrong with the company or say that there's new 1,000 rules that everybody has to obey. But essentially, what I believe in and what the practice has shown me so far is that you can make money, but you can also do it in a healthy way.
And you should.
Yeah, and compliance is there to tell you what is that healthy way actually of doing stuff. And it's always has to be a partnership between people working for as compliance officers, whether you call them compliance officers, integrity officers, ethics officers. There must be a partnership, deepest partnership between the management and us, you know, those guys working in compliance areas. Why? Because it's not just to tick the box, it's not just to select to behave in accordance to the rule. That's even easy
Yeah.
because we have it all written down. Like the roadmap is written down. You have the rules, you obey the rules. Everybody who can read
That's where you
can,
start.
yeah, can tell you what the rules are, what are the do's and don'ts. On one hand, you have a huge area of like a gray area where you're not 100% maybe sure what's the right path. On the other hand, you have areas where there is no rule what to do. There is no prescribed definition, you should do ABC. And in those instances, I have seen so far that the role of compliance is essential. Now, why is it essential and how? It's because it's value driven. So it then comes back to the personal question, what are the values of the people doing this? Do they have integrity and are their values ethics driven? What what is ethics for you? What is ethical for you?
Another great question. Yeah. Um, I mean, maybe first to also come back, you know, circle back to use corporate language to the initial boring definition of what compliance is. And I started by saying, you know, it's ensuring that all external, internal rules are followed, externals being laws, internals being, for example, your code of conduct, right? Because that's something you yourself as a company set up that you don't really have to do, or I mean, depending on what kind of company you are, you might have to. But it's not only that; it's also ensuring ethical, responsible business, right, and operations. Even though, and that can mean to set up specific rules, controls, whatever that might even go beyond what you would have to do legally, right? And so ethically, what's ethically? I guess part of it is, for example, for us as compliance officers, at least, human rights, I guess. I mean, obviously, there are human rights, so we have to obey and follow them by law. But you already mentioned there are gray areas, right? I mean, now it's getting stricter all the time, right? And I think we can all follow that almost daily, right? New EU regulations, new regulations that are even, global or whatever, that affect, for example, also ESG, and that make you check also on your vendors and how they operate to ensure, for example, that there is no child labor involved, right? So this is something that is actually relatively new, which is hard to believe actually, because in my opinion, that's
Yeah.
one thing that should have
Should have
been
been there.
taken care of years ago. And obviously, most companies probably already did it to a certain degree, and I guess some of them probably only did it for their reputation and for their image, and they didn't really care about the children that are doing the labor somewhere in, let's say, India or whatever. But yeah, that's part of it. That's ethical, making sure that you basically treat all your relevant stakeholders, customers, etc., the way that you would like to be treated, right? So I guess that's at least part of it. Or how would you define ethical behavior, especially in this context?
Well, when it comes to business, yeah, for sure, that's a big important pillar of it, to treat the stakeholders as you would like to be treated. Ethical dilemma is as old as time, I would say, so everybody has multiple ethical dilemmas. And when I say ethical dilemma, it's mostly like how to choose what's the right next thing to do. One of the ways how to approach this is actually to chop it in pieces and do step by step, like what's the next right step that I need to do. So what's the next right step that I need to do?
That's a good idea.
And then it all comes to a big chain of, let's say, positive affirmative actions that I have done, which correspond to some values. Yeah. Also based on some previous experience and major studies that have been done in this field, and studies that I have done personally, is that it comes to the values, and it can be also calculated as a profit gain loss situation. Like if you have a group of people that's going to profit from something, or just individual, of course that you're going to select group of people who are going to profit from the decision making process, as opposed to an individual.
Ideally.
If you have a customer base which could profit as opposed to the shareholder, then it becomes a tricky question, because shareholders established a company in order to make profit, and their interest is profit. However, it can be a healthy profit, but it can be also corrosive profit, because everything that we live in, all the history of business has shown us that every time that a company decides to go on a way of corrosive profit, it's going to end up badly. It's not going to end up with them being among top 10 companies or whatever.
No.
And this is especially challenging nowadays, I think, because we are now sitting in 2025 where I would say, since the beginning of the year, all of the values that we know and all of the rules that we know are kind of upside down. In a way, that now we can hear messages that this is not that important, this is not that important. I mean, globally, on a global stage, let's rethink this, let's rethink that. And of course, where I do believe that even in business and even in the compliance community, there have been mistakes made, and there has been over-regulation to some extent. It always brings me back to the question, let's assess the efficiency of stuff. Is this really efficient? Is it effective? And how do we replace something that we are not happy with something that is more effective and efficient, and it will be in the future? But completely denouncing all the value system that we, let's say, had or that we built upon doesn't seem like a good course of action to me.
It's difficult.
Because it's gonna lead us, I believe, in some direction that is not healthy for everybody long term. And that's also one of the things with ethics and ethical thinking. If you wanna make choices which are ethical, then you have to have in mind long term consequences. To make a decision which is short term profitable or short term gains, that's very easy. And that choice is very easy. But to decide something on the long term, it actually means that you need to question and try to predict something that might happen in the future. Now, how do you predict stuff that can happen in the future? Well, only based on historical data.
Exactly.
On something that has already happened, and you see how did it happen, and you try to be, let's say, a risk manager from time to time in your own life, in your own personal and then professional life, and try to navigate all those stuff. But every time I talk about ethics or even think about is this ethical, it comes down to the story of values. And if you have a set of value, which we all have, but they just may be different, everything that you do and that gets you closer to your set of values is more authentical to you. But authentical to you doesn't mean that it is actually ethical and good for the community. And if something is not inherently good for the community, it's quite hard that it's going to be ethical, and it's quite hard that it's going to be healthy long term.
No.
If you think about all the big regulations that have been passed on in the last couple of years, especially in EU, and EU is highly criticized because of the over-regulation and everything.
Yeah.
But if you think about big time regulations like GDPR, like EU AI Act, like DORA and stuff like that, none of those regulations were actually adopted just because, or because somebody decided that they need something else to do. For example, GDPR in its essence, from my point of view, is an ethical regulation. Because what does it protect? It protects you as a private individual, your privacy, your private data from an abuse which can inherently happen randomly by any company at any point of time to gain their profit. And the regulation says, no, stop it here. This is the boundary, because conducting something opposite to these rules would mean that you are behaving unethically towards an individual. So when we say that even compliance or ethics or rules can be annoying or over-regulated or over too much, we usually forget that the main focus of ethics regulations is actually an individual and your individual rights. And they are created for you because of us and for us to protect us. Because, again, business and companies, they are doing their own thing, and they're going to be doing their own thing as they should, as they are supposed to do it. And it's not the opposites. Like, business and compliance and ethics are not the opposites. I refuse that premise always. It has to be integrated together. It has to function together because, yes, your goal is to make profit, but guess what? Your goal is to make profit long term. And then when you see that goal of ethics is to give proper values to people long term, then you immediately see that there's a common denominator between those two. And then you say, okay, let's sit down and see how can we actually make this happen to work for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, true. How can we make it sustainable, right?
Yeah. And you think that, of course, that your personal activities, they fuel you, they give you fuel and energy to do the stuff that you do at work, to be a part of compliance world, to be a researcher as you are currently and doing research stuff on compliance. But why do you think that people sometimes have this pushback and pressure towards compliance? Because even people, when you say to them, I work in compliance, first of all, a huge number of them have no idea what are you doing, what the hell are you doing. And then in business, people are kind of like, stop here. They have a pushback. Why do you think that's
True. Those are
the
basically the
case?
two main reactions, right? Either
Yeah.
they don't know or they hate you for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And well, I guess it all has to do with, you know, compliance awareness, compliance education, training, right? And also compliance communication. And all that obviously then in the end also links to or leads to your compliance culture, right? When speaking of a company, right? Like, what does your compliance culture look like? How do people view compliance? And as we have already mentioned, usually it's rather negative, unfortunately. And obviously, on the business side, especially, it's due to them thinking that we are basically an obstacle on their way to doing business, which is not the case, right? We already discussed it, and hopefully, many of your listeners will also see that and agree with us. It's not about hindering anyone from doing business. It's the exact opposite. We want you to do business, we want you to be successful. We do want to maximize shareholder value as well, right? But we want to do it in a healthy, sustainable way. We want to make it in a way that is in line with all the different laws and rules that we have. And even more than that, right? That is in line with, let's say, ethical, moral standards that might not be legally, that we might not be legally obligated to do or to follow or to comply with, but we still want to do it um, to, as mentioned before, ensure a healthy organization in general, right?
So basically, it's educating people.
Definitely, definitely. I think that's a major part, and that's the biggest challenge. How do you communicate to especially your employees, but actually all stakeholders, right? Why compliance is so important and why we do it, and that we actually do it to protect them in the end, right? It's not only to protect ourselves as compliance officers because of some possible personal liability, maybe depending on your position and so on, but it's to protect the company, it's to protect the employees, right? Because compliance is usually not only about, I mean, we are in the banking industry, so obviously we focus a lot on like money laundering and sanctions and tax evasion, fraud, corruption, etc. And that all sounds very exciting, especially for people that have nothing to do with it. But it's also labor law, right? It's also about discrimination. It's ensuring that everyone feels treated fairly, and is treated fairly, not only feels like it, but that it actually is that case as well. Regardless of where they are from, what their beliefs are, what their sexual orientation is, or whatever, right? That's also compliance, and I think that's also something that many people actually don't know. And I think if you could find a way to explain that to them in a good way, make it a little entertaining, maybe, or whatever it takes, whatever it needs for people to really understand it and also to remember it, right? And not
Mm.
to completely forget about everything you just taught them the next time they want to do a big deal with one customer and compliance again. They need me to do something that I don't want to do. They need me to ask the customer to do something that the customer doesn't want to do, and blah
Yeah.
blah blah. Because I think the first step would be to make sure that your employees, your colleagues actually understand it. Because then, if they truly get it, then they will probably and hopefully also explain it to the customer, right? And then you just go and make the full circle. But if that's already the first blockage that you have there, right, between you as a compliance officer and your fellow colleagues and employees, yeah, I think that that's the first obstacle that you have to overcome
Yeah.
somehow.
And you have a good point there that it all comes back again to us as individuals in the same manner as regulations are there to protect us and protect the companies. At the same time, compliance is there to protect everybody. It's in a way a consciousness of the organization, and it's there to help you on your day-to-day stuff, day-to-day situations that might occur to you. And then again, it all comes back to the beginning of our story, and that is that, like, since we have invented even um, religion rules and all of that, it's because we have concluded to some way that if we would live without rules, it would be a mess. Yeah, it would be a chaos, obviously, and we have tried that and it didn't work. And whenever in history we try to loosen up some rules, it doesn't end up well, because in our nature there's something about people, and many people have researched this. There's something super greedy inside of people and something very prone to doing unethical stuff.
Yeah.
They've done researches in US, and they've said, like, it's enough that you steal a paper clipper and you can turn to be a big time fraudster
Yeah.
in the company, because
The opportunity
when
is
you
there.
see, of course, when you see the opportunity and
Yeah.
when you see that there's no consequence, and when you have self justification of stuff, and when you have a pressure at your work and you kind of a bit hate your employer, and then you steal a first paper clipper,
Yeah.
and or you say a first lie, even when it happens to personal relationships. And I do think that all of it's really interconnected, and I do believe that, again, our values reflect us privately and then also in the business. Do you think that ethical people are more happy?
I think so. Yeah. Because as mentioned before, I think it has a lot to do with, treating other people the way you also would like to be treated, right? So I
But
know I
that's not
mentioned
easy.
stakeholders before,
Yeah.
but in reality, it applies to everyone, right?
But it's not easy task.
I know. It's
Sometimes
easier
people
said
hate
than
you.
done,
Yeah.
like most things in life, actually.
Yeah.
um, but I guess you just have to keep trying. It gets easier. It might sound stupid, but it really does. And sometimes we have to actively remind ourselves of those simple things that all of us should know and should apply in their own lives, right? But it's true. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. Um, we tend to mirror people, right? And so,
Exactly.
and therefore making other people smile, which actually already is like, if you can manage to do that in your office, great job, because it's going to make a big difference. It's going to make people happy. It's going to make them, enjoy their work. It's going to make them do their work better, therefore. But I'm also obviously talking about the way you behave, the way you treat others, the way you, for example, in the office, stick to certain rules that maybe not everyone sticks to or whatever, because people will notice that and it will affect them. And it's very likely that they will also start being more responsible, more ethical, whatever you want to call it, just because they saw you being
Yeah.
like that. Leading by example. That's basically it, right?
Yeah. It reminds me for a quote to a quote from a song, like, to be translated is, happiness is the only thing that grows after divided. So yeah,
Beautiful.
I'm gonna stop now here because we should wrap up this first episode. Okay, Andrew, and thank you very much for being first guest of the first episode of Keep It Simple podcast. I do hope that our listeners are gonna enjoy our conversation on compliance, ethics, happiness. And yeah, hear you soon. Maybe in some of other episodes, you may visit us again.
I would love to.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.